that up. So welcome everyone. My name is Oisin Keown. I'm here today as a representative of the Scottish Centre for Continental Philosophy based at Dundee. It's my great pleasure today to introduce Professor David Wills for one of our ongoing Royal Institute of Philosophy talks this semester. As a quick reminder about upcoming events, Michael Heinrich and Etienne Balabar will be joining us next month. Details will be provided by Frank in the coming weeks. So just to highlight that Michael Heinrich, who is due to speak next week, is going to be postponed for a few weeks due to strike action in the United Kingdom. Today's speaker, David Wills, is a professor of French and Francophone studies at Brown University in the USA. In his illustrious career, mostly based in institutions in the USA, but also as a guest lecturer at over 50 institutions around the world, including in Europe and the South Pacific. He's become one of the world's foremost Derrida scholars and one of, if I may say so, Derrida's very best translators. Most recently, retranslating Derrida's Glas as clang with Geoffrey Bennington. David also gave Dundee students a distinct honor in allowing us to read, in the module I'm currently teaching, is as yet unpublished translation of Derrida's second set of pardon and perjury seminars that discuss the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission. An honor and a gift for which I and the students are forever grateful, has allowed our classroom in Dundee to be the first to extensively engage with this text in English ahead of its publication later this year. As well as a gifted translator, David is the author of many monographs, most recently in 2019, Killing Times, the Temporal Technology of the Death Penalty. The title is illustrative of one of his major concerns, namely rethinking what technology is and does, and then thinking about the political ramifications of this re-articulation of technology. Such a concern is evident, for example, in one of his most well-known books. I first encountered him in 2008, entitled Dorsality, Thinking Back to Technology and Politics. At the heart of that book is a turn away from technology commonly understood as a production or creation, something mankind makes, or as he puts it, quote, a fabrication produced by hands manipulating matter within a visible field, unquote, the definition of technology which allows us to understand the technology of, quote, the human itself inside itself, unquote, such that self-division of the cell inside the human, or indeed any living being, is understood to be an articulation of technology already. David names this way of engaging with technology, dorsality, coming from the adjective dorsal, of or on or near the back of a so-called animal. But I don't want to get ahead of David. I don't want to go in front of him, run ahead of him, precisely because mankind's dorsal turn for him is more than simply when mankind, assuming an upright posture, standing tall, evolved to walk on two legs, but how mankind standing tall, quote, turns its back in a radical way on whatever is behind it, quote, to focus on the forward-looking, on what is ahead, with its frontal field of vision, with its forward-facing fabrications and tools ready to hand. As I said, though, I don't want to get ahead of David, so now let me pass over to, or rather turn back to, David and his talk, or perhaps in light of the music we just played, his jamming session entitled Spoonful, the Dorsal Deconstruction of Eroticism. Give me a moment while now I put up the PowerPoint. Can I confirm just that people can see the PowerPoint now?
Not I.
No, me neither.
Now?
Yes.
Good. I'm going to now mute myself and let David take over. Floor is yours.
I don't see myself. Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
We can see you. Don't worry. You're still there.
Okay. I wasn't sure. I have to apologize for that bad rendition of Spoonful. I usually sing it much better than that. But you can listen to it in your own time. So thank you for the invitation, Oisin. Thanks, people, for being here. I'll start the talk. So about 9/10 of the way through Derrida, the 2002 documentary film by Kirby Dick and Amy Kaufman, Kaufman decides to ask Derrida what he would like to see in a documentary about a philosopher such as Heidegger, Kant, or Hegel. After pausing for 10 seconds to scratch his ear, stare into space, and draw his hand down across his cheeks and mouth, Derrida replies that he would like to see consideration of their sex lives, leur vie sexuelle. He adds to that quip somewhat glibly, if you want a quick answer, okay? Before expanding upon it more seriously. So he goes on to say that I want them to talk about their sex lives, or that in the film, one talks about their sex life because it's what they don't talk about. I'd like them to talk about what they don't talk about. Why are these philosophers presented as asexual, asexués, in their work? Why have they erased their sexual life from their work? And why have they never taken into account their private lives? When I say sex life, I mean private, their private lives. There is nothing more important in private life than love. I want them to talk about the part played by love in their private life. End of quote. And in response to a follow-up question concerning whether he, Derrida, would like to be asked to do the same in the documentary film being filmed, he replies that he didn't say he would answer such a question, but, quote, there are in the text I have published quite a few things. They're also disguised, dissimulé, of course, but I haven't practiced the same type of dissimulation as the great philosophers you have just named. I've dissimulated, of course. I've dissimulated like everybody else, but not in the same way. I talk about it when I want to and when I can, end of quote. The sequence ends with Derrida asking the filmmakers what they're going to do with all of this, how their editing will determine what to keep in the film, which is tantamount to asking how much of the back and forth just recorded will be added to the archive, to the text and discourse of philosophy. As I read it, we can take advantage of this juxtaposition of Derrida's double desire, on the one hand, to have philosophers in philosophy speak of sex, or of the sex, love, and intimacy they avoid, and on the other, to know what, in the same general context, the film he is in will keep in or leave out, what it will show explicitly or censor, if you like. I want to take advantage of that to reflect on the erotics of deconstruction in terms of everything that thinking does with the play of presence and absence, with what falls in or out of the space that is opened by every utterance in what Derrida calls its essential iterability. For if every utterance is a repetition, even as it presents itself as something original, then every utterance in so doing opens space between what it is heard to say and what it is heard not to say. Every utterance speaks, therefore, through a type of structural double entendre. The sex lives that philosophers don't talk about, the quite a few things that the philosopher Derrida claims conversely to have spoken about, are therefore not simply functions of the connotations that this or that philosopher decides or decides not to allow in his writing. They are not simply functions of this or that practice of dissimulation. Rather, the possibilities of dissimulation and double entendre, of expression and repression, are allowed by the essential iterability just referred to. The understanding of différance that we owe to Derrida means that utterance is conceived simultaneously as self and other, as sameness and difference. For that reason, the utterances of philosophy are neither transparent nor self-evident. Debate may take place about what they mean. Contradictions may be revealed between what a given philosopher writes in one place and in another. For the same reason, this or that philosopher may presume that their sex life does or does not belong in their discourse, whereas another may decide that it does, but in a dissimulated way. Yet, still for the same reason, irrespective of this or that choice by this or that philosopher, their utterances will go about their own business of doubling, as it were, on those utterances' own initiative. Derrida's periphrastic explanation of the sex lives he wants to hear about from philosophers, quote, I mean private lives, the part played by love, demonstrates the difficulty of determining what constitutes the erotic, where sex begins and ends, how it does or doesn't relate to love, to what extent it should be understood as private. The erotic from that point of view has its own particularly complex version of generalized or essential iterability, its own special negotiation of the space opened by its utterances or practices. Roland Barthes, a somewhat or sometime kindred speaker to Derrida, or kindred thinker to Derrida, gave to erotic space the name intermittence. Quoting, I think this is from The Pleasure of the Text, is not the most erotic portion of the body where the garment gapes. It is intermittence which is erotic, the intermittence of skin flashing between two articles of clothing. It is this flash itself which seduces, or rather, the staging of an appearance as disappearance, end of quote. Without ignoring the distinctions, virtual or actual, between private or sexual life and eroticism, one might set about tracking from end to beginning of the discourse of deconstruction a series of versions of erotic intermittence, spaces where the discourse with which Derrida's philosophy clothes itself gapes to reveal some skin. For example, backwards, decade by decade, one might see these examples selected among various other possibilities. So these are quoted in the first slide on the PowerPoint. In 2003, in the second year of the final seminar, his final seminar, The Beast and the Sovereign, Derrida sets out a principle of intermittence when discussing his disjointed comparative reading of Heidegger and Defoe. He argues that his practice of the seminar requires, quote, first quote, a certain number of leaps. I don't see the top of the quote on my screen, but maybe you do. A certain number of leaps, certain new perspectives, another view of the whole, like, for example, when you were driving a car on a mountain road, a hairpin or a turn, an abrupt and precipitous elevation gives you in an instant a new perspective, end of quote. For, he adds in parentheses, in case you're wondering what this has to do with what I am saying, the next quote in parentheses, it goes without saying that each of my choices and my perspectives depend broadly here, as I will never try to hide, on my history, my previous work, and my way of driving on this road, on my drives, desires, and phantasms, even if I always try to make them both intelligible, shareable, convincing, and open to discussion, end of quote. In 2000, in On Touching, Jean-Luc Nancy, almost at the end of a long book that I'll come back to later in the talk, a book, one of whose thematic threads is that of kissing eyes, he writes this, next quote, the principle of philosophy is not philosophy, which might therefore consist in no more than a frenzied forgetting of the first kiss. I, the philosopher, hypothetically, run to catch the recollection of the first kiss, end of quote. So continuing this very limited set of examples, but more quickly now, in 1998, in A Silkworm of One's Own, a first-person narrator recounts the childhood experience of, quote, an orifice you had to imagine to be at the origin of their silk, this milk become thread, the extruded saliva of a very fine sperm, shiny, gleaming, the miracle of a feminine ejaculation, which I drank in with my eyes, End of quote. In 1985, in Right of Inspection, looking at a photographic text involving, among other things, women making love, one of the unidentified and ungendered voices says, "I was saying that the question of genre poses and develops sexual difference in its most undecided and unstable form, precisely as a difference that trembles." End of quote. Still going back, in 1974, he published Klang, with its polymorphous perversion of text by Hegel through association and contamination with texts by Genet, two erections or columns that continue for 274 pages without touching, unless it be that they do nothing but that, nothing but caress, embrace, and penetrate each other across and in the blank space between them. And final example, of course, in 1967, of Grammatology had already staged the now famous analytical scene of Rousseau's supplementary sex, his recourse to masturbation as, quote, "the dangerous supplement that breaks with nature," end of quote. Rousseau's quote, quoted by Derrida. Indeed, beyond the sexuality that haunts Rousseau, according to Derrida's analysis in Grammatology, one should understand the more general concept of auto-affection, it's going to be my key term, auto-affection to be operating as the originary trace or différance to which it is related there and elsewhere, functioning as something like the beginning itself. I want you to hear that both as reflexive, beginning itself, and as emphatic, the beginning itself of deconstruction. So functioning auto-affection as something like the beginning itself of deconstruction. It also describes the beginning itself of life, of the animate. Quote, "Auto-affection is the condition of an experience in general, another name for life," end of quote. In other examples that extend from the formal development of auto-affection as hearing oneself speak in Voice and Phenomenon, 1967, to the autobiography of the animal that therefore I am, 30 years later, where it is described as, quote, "the trace of the living for itself, being for itself, the auto-affection or auto-infection as memory or archive of the living." In those quotes, Derrida means by auto-affection, in general, the opening of self-sameness to otherness, without which, one might say, nothing gets going at one end, or nothing gets off at the other. That is for him a function of every autos, every ipseity, and by means of it, auto-affection becomes, as he says in The Animal That Therefore I Am, quote, "an automatic, automobile, autonomous, auto-referential movement," end of quote. Auto-affection is also, in many respects, another word for iterability. As I just made clear, every auto-affection, or as I suggested at least, every auto-affection is a hetero-affection, an originary othering of the self, and is to that extent an iteration of the self as other. I don't mean that every iteration is in opposition to the previous one, but rather that the possibility of iteration, a necessary possibility, not one that can ever be reduced, includes the possibility of iteration, includes every possibility of othering, including what I'll call inversion, for example, that of the autos into the heteros or allos. Such is the problematic of Rousseau's dangerous supplement, the fact that it works or threatens to supplant the supposed natural act inasmuch as it repeats or simulates it. Rousseau has recourse to it in the absence of the woman he calls Maman, Madame de Warrens, cognizance of which, of her absence, cognizance of which brings her back as a participant in it, however phantasmatic or hallucinatory her participation be. That is, he masturbates in her absence, which makes her being absent a part of the experience, so somehow making her present. And conversely, when she is there with him having natural sex, whenever her participation is real, she is both present and absent, for he is both receiving pleasure from her and giving pleasure to himself. There can be no original proffering or act either of the self or of the utterance. Whatever the self does to get going, as I just characterized it, whatever it utters, is performed as a supplement to, a repetition as différence of the absent original. It occurs in the absence of any pure autonomous self, any autos, or any purely invented utterance, any logos. This automatic double entendre means that even without the specifics of Rousseau's masturbation melancholy, auto-affection in all its guises will share its structure with eroticism. It will be both the operation of touching on, as it were in all innocence, the otherness in the self, and of touching through every imaginable experience, the self and whatever the self takes as other. Anywhere anything begins, it begins as auto-affection and functions as the self-stimulation that can be heard in that term, functioning coextensively, therefore, with what we understand as eroticism. So the remainder of this discussion, this paper, will turn around an emblem of what I consider to be deconstructionist eroticism in Derrida's The Postcard from 1980 in French. I'll call it an erotic coat of arms. And in discussing this scene of heraldry, I'll come to concentrate especially on the escutcheon at its center. An escutcheon, slide 2, an escutcheon, as Webster has it, is a defined area on which armorial bearings are displayed. And this is described more precisely by the OED as the shield or shield-shaped surface on which a coat of arms is depicted. Also, in wider sense, the shield with the armorial bearings, a sculptured or painted representation of this. A coat of arms, also called an heraldic achievement, the word is achievement, is always figural. Like the eagle, slide 3, the eagle bearing an olive branch in its right talon and arrows in its left, in the Great Seal of the United States, whose achievement bespeaks might on the one hand and peace, with a supposed preference for the latter determined by the eagle's head being turned to the right. The escutcheon in this US example is the centerpiece shield containing a modified flag with alternating white and red stripes representing the 13 original colonies of the US. The arms and escutcheon that I'll draw from the postcard will also be primarily figural and figurative, but of course, verbal. It is found in Envois, the major text in the postcard, slide 4. So here is the quote, here is my coat of arms. And after the telephone call, Derrida's narrator writes, after the telephone call, I will turn my back to you to sleep as usual, and you will cling up against me, giving me your hand, you will envelop me. The sentence presents no double entendre in the simple sense. On the surface level, there is nothing sexual necessarily implied. It is not as if the narrator says something non-sexual while allowing or encouraging something sexual. Yet at the same time, it opens the text on two principal fronts. In the first place, it functions both constitutively, so you will do such and such, I understand or imagine you to be doing such and such, and performatively, as invitation from the narrator to their lover to indulge in the acts or actions described. Cling to me, give me your hand, envelop me. My reading will work within that undecidable margin between what the fragment from Envois states and what it performs, increasingly as we approach the two figures lying at its center. In the second place, the chosen sentence introduces a fruitful but potentially troubling undecidability concerning what constitutes the erotic what distinguishes sex from love or intimacy, and undecidability concerning what sex is and what this sex is, who is doing it. More specifically, as I'll discuss in conclusion, this utterance goes to the very heart of touching. In the background of the escutcheon's elements, as I shall read them, is an idea I have developed previously under the name of dorsality. In that discussion, one of whose epigraphs is precisely the quote in question, the dorsal is presented as a technological inversion of the frontal, as Oisin described earlier, which is not the same as an inversion of the frontal by technology. It is not the performance of a technological contrivance, not some natural frontal being turned around by the invention of technology. Rather, the hypothesis of dorsality is this: what we presume to be a natural human is always already technological, such that the human relations, ethical, political, sexual, that traditionally depend on frontality, on some form of face-to-face, are subjected to indeed make the deviation that I call the dorsal turn. The first step in the development of that hypothesis involves locating human technology in the back by arguing for its having originated in the bipedal upright stance of the human, in the readjustment of the spinal column that freed the hands for manipulation of tools. Technology in this interpretation is understood to reside behind or before the human, and as just mentioned, the human is defined as originarily technological. The second step, that of introducing dorsality into human relations, promotes radical ideas of otherness, or ideas of radical otherness, opening to what lies outside the frontal visual perspective of the knowable. The dorsal, by definition, cannot be foreseen, is a function of surprise, implies exposure to vulnerability. Dorsal inversion involves turning or opening toward another that surprises to the extent of, all the way to the possibility of, being inanimate. Within the dorsal relation, ethical, political, or sexual, we are called on to deal not only with what escapes the visual perspective of the knowable, but also with an unknowability about what constitutes the other coming from behind. The dorsal relation can therefore also be called prosthetic, in the sense of relating to what is as radically other as artificial is to natural, as steel is to flesh, and reawakening the human in us to its irrecuperable technological otherness. To return now to my escutcheon, and after the telephone call, I will turn back to you to sleep as usual, and you will cling up against me, giving me your hand. You will envelop me. The central clause, cling up against me, which Alan Bass justifiably translates, so this is my modified translation, in the text itself, he translates it as, you will paste yourself against me, resonates with the enveloping of the final clause. I turn my back, you cling to me, you adhere to me, sticking, pasted, or glued like a postage stamp, you wrap me up. Within the seal of the United States, if we can have that slide again, I think it's the next slide. The 13 white and red stripes of its escutcheon stick to each other back to front, nestling against each other, adhering like a stack of stripes, 13 canned sardines. In American English, next slide, in American English, one would say, there we go, one would say that the two characters in the quotation are spooning. The OED also has to spoon as a verb, both transitive and intransitive, citing mostly late 19th century examples. So intransitively, to lie close together, to fit into each other in the manner of spoons. And an example from Harper's Magazine in 1887, 2 persons in each bunk, the sleepers spooning together, packed like sardines. Or an 1894 example, the precision with which we could spoon that sad night was truly beautiful to behold. And in the transitive sense, to lie with a person spoon fashion, once again, 1887 from Harper's, now spoon me, quote, Sterling stretched himself out on the warm flagstone and the boy nestled up against him. In spooning, 2 bodies borrow the same form, the one behind shaping itself to the curvature of the other's back, adopting the appearance of nestling spoons, performing a dorsal snuggle. Yet that supremely human or animal gesture finds its figure in the stacking of everyday utensils in an impersonal multiplicity of utilitarian objects that seem far from suggesting the tender intimacy of 2 bodies lying in harmonious togetherness, perhaps in the afterglow of an act of love. Now, no objection can be made to that from a rhetorical point of view. There is no particular dehumanizing effect intended by this analogy between figures and spoons. Figurative language performs such gestures all the time. Spooning occurs as eminently human, even if the sense of sight and vision lose the reciprocity that love demands, for one spooner or one spoon looks into emptiness, one is touched more than touching, one spoon is full of the other, and both resort or regress delicately into animality, into scent and nuzzling, coupling a tergo. Next slide, please. 2 spoons are imagined in the center of my escutcheon. On one side and the other of those spoons, there appear a telephone and an envelope. After the telephone call, you will do this, we will spoon, you will envelop me. The syntax of the sentence puts the spooning within the double thematic, therefore, of the telephone and the envelope. Now, between phone and envelope might be heard to mean as between voice, phone, and letter, gramme. But although that is how the syntax is heard or read at first sight, understanding it in that way would mean ignoring the extent to which the voice is already telephonized, diverted into technological space. The voice is spoken as if live, but its life is detoured through telephone lines. It performs the oxymoron of a live relaying or recording. In Derrida's terms, as developed extensively in the postcard, the message conveyed by the voice gets posted. It necessarily has recourse to a system of messaging, transporting, sorting, distributing, that involves multiple effects of distancing, relay, and delay. One can address one's message as clearly and as explicitly as one wishes, cup one's hands like 2 facing spoons and utter directly into the ear of the other whom one is spooning, but the message will still have to travel, however minute the space of transmission be. One will still have to entrust it to a postal system within which everything that happens is outside one's control. So it is as if the voice were uttering its message into a slit in a postbox. In speaking, as in writing, one is effectively mailing a postcard. The phone and envelope of the escutcheon thus operate through what the postcard analyzes as postal space. The spooning is said to follow a telephone call, le coup de téléphone. The most straightforward reading of that would be that I spoke on the phone and then we spooned. More precisely, that after I will have spoken on the phone, we will spoon. But that reading is complicated from a number of perspectives. Most importantly, it is complicated from the sexual perspective. The spooning to come seems post-coital. After, le coup de téléphone, after I will turn my back to you to sleep. But the full performativity of that utterance comes into play once we infer that it is you that I will have been speaking to on the phone. The previous parts of this letter from 24 September 1977, talk about letters that I write and post to you, leading the reader to presume that they are separate, as indeed the two characters, as indeed they always are. I will therefore have been speaking to an absent you before I turn my back. As for telephoning, it happens in various places throughout the text. 2 days previous, there is a parenthesis within which we were telephoning each other. Hence, although I continue to infer a sexualization of the spooning scene, a certain logic here determines that the sex is first found on or in the telephone, that there is phone sex, after which we will spoon. I say that for reasons I'll come to in a moment, but it is also said somewhat disingenuously, based as it is on thinking they were closer, as if together when they spoke on the phone, whereas they will be apart when they spoon. If you wish, I just imagine that I will turn my back to you to sleep and we will spoon. That is how it usually is, my habit, comme d'habitude, when we're making love, when we're together. So the disingenuousness of saying that they have phone sex derives from my recourse to a presumption about the speaking voice being more present when the contrary argument has just been made. The voice is precisely telephonized, technologized, absented by being consigned to the postal principle. The phone signifies absence as much as does the envelope. My saying there is phone sex is justified differently. It is based on a series of sexual usages of the word coup in French. To give you the most crass, tirer un coup means to get it off, hook up, get laid. Tirer son coup can mean to shoot one's load to climax. By extension, then, after the coup de téléphone may be interpreted as following our phone sex. But even there, calling it phone sex is only a manner of speaking. The idea that the sex these spoons will have been indulging in occurs as a telephone coup or call doesn't in fact make the telephone call a euphemism for sex or make it phone sex. That is to say, a mutual stimulation by means of the voice, an OTO affection in the usual sense. Rather, it amounts to saying, according to the logic of Envois, that the only sex that can ever be involving these two lovers will have to take place over the phone, over the ocean, through the mail. As I have said, the protagonist lovers never meet in the sense that we normally understand as real. They are never together in the present space of the text itself. There is only indirect contact, only postcards. They meet only in the postal, or in this case, telephonic space of multiple relays. In that space, fictive space if you wish, they have sex. Hence, telephone at one end and envelope and spooning in between share the same structural space within the erotic escutcheon, the space of what will not have taken place. In the final analysis, therefore, I really have no idea what is going on in what I'll call this spoonful. From phone call to envelope, let alone in the spooning itself, I cannot account for all the organs or their organization. Yet even if it is only my drive, desire, or phantasm at work, I will continue to read this escutcheon as if the spoons in it are sexually involved, having sex, albeit in the sense of having had sex. Wherever the sex is found to be, it will have been indirect, over the phone, or through the envelope. And its protagonists will be far from stable subjects. Readers of Envois are warned of indirection from the first moment of the preface upon being told that what they are about to read is to be read as, quote, the preface to a book that I have not written. A couple of pages later, they will be further confounded upon learning that, quote, the signers and the addressees are not always identical from one envoi to the other. The envois are thus a prefatory explanation of what the narrator planned to say, or what he or would have said had he remained constant from one instance to the next, or had he known that his addressee remained constant, or had he been able to prevent the reader from butting in. In short, he would have gone straight to it had there not been indirection, but there is indirection necessarily. A bottomless mailbox opens as soon as one posts a letter, an abyss wherein there is not only detour and delay, indirection and redirection, but also, because it involves a radical interruption, indeed rupture at the heart of the system, also inversion, back to frontness, that is to say, a turning around and by extension, dorsal spooning. Throughout Envois, there is, we are told, next slide for these quotes, we are told there is not a word that would not be programmed on the back. No, sorry, next slide. Thank you. Not a word that would not be programmed on the back, au dos. In a word, there will only be backs, du dos. And we have already heard another voice in the same book say, next quote, everything is connoted in dos. It's only the backs that count. Look back over the entire scansion, not the das in forte da or Derrida, but also the most drawling dos. Then one has to start everything over once more. One has to go back over everything again. To reprendre. So telephone, envelope, stamp, 2 spoons. These are the elements figured in this dorsal erotic escutcheon, the coat of arms of the postal system. Once everything becomes a postcard again, it's a quote from the book, once the fact and threat of spacing haunts every message, infecting and invading every communication, but also inhabiting it structurally from the beginning, then the postal effect abounds. The spoons nestle within that postal effect. However snug they be, however much one touch the other, however much one take the other inside itself, they necessarily communicate across the space between them. Without that postal space, there would be no communicating, no need or possibility of it. Yet because of that space, there is necessarily delay and deferral, the necessary possibility of detour and diversion, return and inversion, turning back and turning around. Postal space, the space of every touch and contact, which we might now call spooning space, is the space of difference. Next quote, without this difference, next slide, thanks. Without this difference, there's autocorrect in there, should be with an A. Without this difference, there would be no contact as such, but with this difference, contact never appears in its full purity. Our last section. Between telephone and envelope, then, falls the spooning. Yet even between the spoons falls the postal abyss. Something called an abyss is in fact commonly found in the center of a coat of arms, placed precisely in its escutcheon, a shield within a shield, one bigger escutcheon spooning another. For that we borrow in English the French term mise en abîme, putting in the abyss, or we use our own English, in fact, has a single word, in escutcheon. For example, during the Commonwealth, next slide, Cromwell had his lion rampant en abîme as in escutcheon in the coat of arms from 1655 to 1659. Similarly, next slide, the United Kingdom of George III had first the Elector, then the King of Hanover as in escutcheons from 1801 to 1820. Every escutcheonal spooning harbors or accommodates the inescapable possibility of an inescutcheonal abyss. The spooned spoon leans back into the spooning spoon, en abîme, as the French would say, as if at the risk of falling into such an abyss. Image within an image within an image. It is in response to, or for fear of that, that you give me your hand. I turn my back, you spoon me, clinging to me. I feel the abyss at or in my back. You give me your hand. In or across the abyssal inescutcheon of spooning between me and you, between us and the abyss, there is, happily, it seems, your given hand. It is therefore a hand that we should imagine as inescutcheon, in abyss, between the spooning spoons. But I'm not at all sure that it appears on this heraldic achievement, that it can be figured there, for it is something of a spectral hand. It wants to appear, to be found and held there. The hetero-affirmativity of this moment and this gesture, giving me your hand, would promise the cadence and repose of harmonious love that we were always seeking. The fulfillment of a love threatened by, but overcoming, the abyss of separation. The letter of 24 September 1977 ends on that note with my quote, the spooning quote, and its seemingly reassuring consummation, warm dorsal embrace, hand touching hand. I give you my back, you give me your hand. With this explicit touching, we are in the heart of eroticism and in the private love life of philosophy. Now, it might be objected that there has been nothing but touch at work in this scene, that everything I have said about spooning is determined by touching, reinforced by clinging and enveloping. But the hand foregrounds touch in a different way, or foregrounds a different understanding of touching. And it is by means of this hand that you give me that the abyssal abyssal rupture structuring, spooning, which I've tried to describe, far from being resolved, comes back into force, into focus. The hand also returns us to the question raised in the earlier part of this discussion, that of auto-affection as originary trace or différence, as in Rousseau's recourse to his dangerous supplement. As I suggested, in giving himself his hand, in the absence of Madame de Warrens, he was in fact giving her his hand so she could touch him with it. Or else, though absent, she came to him phantasmatically, bringing her hand to take his hand to give it back to him to pleasure himself. As we have consistently seen, the self-caress, like hearing oneself speak, cannot function without opening a space within that self, the same structural space within which another operates. Even caressing oneself means opening oneself to another. The hand one uses is always, in some sense, the hand of another. Or, to put it as a general hypothesis regarding eroticism, eroticism is possible only through recourse to something outside the purity of an intact, integral self. The mechanics of that auto-hetero-affection, developed by Derrida from his earliest writings, is again under the microscope in On Touching, the book-length analysis inspired by the work of Jean-Luc Nancy. So now I think we have the next slide. Even when we are in self-touch, Derrida writes, or when the touching ones touch themselves, they are in touch with something other than themselves and are touched by something other than the same self that touches. The something other mentioned here reintroduces the dorsal logic I described. Auto-affection opens a structure of self-othering that goes all the way to reversibility. So that whereas I think I am facing myself to touch myself, I am in fact creating another self who might turn around to face and touch me. But also, or instead, whereas I think I am facing myself to touch myself, I am in fact spooning or am being spooned by another who, adhering symmetrically back against me, touches me, having me think or feel that I am touching myself. As on touching makes abundantly clear, this reversal, whereby I produce and set to work another to have me feel I touch myself, amounts to a technological inversion or reversal of the frontal. Derrida credits Nancy with being the thinker who insists above all that the other I turn around to touch myself, even as I think I am self-caressing, is an otherness, a what as much as a whom. The originary opening of différance thus becomes, quote, the ageless intrusion of techniques, which is to say of transplantation or prosthetics. Transplantation greffe or prosthetics prothèse. In the terms of our escutcheon, not only do the spoons come to interrupt the sex or lovemaking taking place between telephone and envelope, not only do they figure the cold steel of the inanimate within the supposed living communication of the voice or even of the letter that is presumed to have transcribed that voice, but in their very spooning, as it were, between the spooners nestling snugly, one curving to the fit of the other, in the space or abyss of their touching, in their very contact, there occurs the rupture mentioned earlier, referred to by Derrida as elsewhere on touching as, quote, a différance in the very inside of the haptic. In spooning, there is produced a space that suffers the intrusion of prosthetic otherness, such that these spoons or spooners perhaps cannot even be said to touch. Next slide, next quote. Thanks. So series of quotes here. Isn't it necessary that the spacing open up the place for replacement, that it make room for the substitute, for the metonymical supplement, and for technicity? I wonder whether there is any pure auto-affection of the touching or the touched, and therefore any pure immediate experience of the purely proper body, the body proper that is living, purely living. End of quote. Without différance or spacing, there can be no affection. Nothing touches anything. The spoons are simply fused. But once there is the spacing making provision for, allowing for auto-affection, then there is also necessarily enabling of hetero-affection, an opening of the door to every heterogeneity, including prosthetic intrusion. Continuing the passage just quoted, Derrida asks whether the experience of touching, next quote, is at least not already haunted, but constitutively haunted by some hetero-affection related to spacing, where an intruder may come through. End of quote. This technological intrusion of the general prostheticity or technical supplementarity of the body permits, but at the same time inverts or perverts such an interanimate haptic affection. Next quote. This supplementarity of technical prosthesis spaces out, defers, or expropriates all originary properness. There is no essential originary touching before its necessary possibility for every living being in general. From the beginning, what we might call the origin of life, nothing animate moves or self-affects without such a supplement, however dangerous in this or that case it come to be. So the hand that you give me haunts in that way the abyssal center of the erotic escutcheon. What consummates the spooning intrudes awkwardly upon it. Though its reassuring touch seemed to provide just the protection we need, it is a spectral hand, the hand of another hand given to me, but also an other hand, a hand of otherness, a supplementary hand, a substitute hand, a prosthetic hand. For it stands to reason. If you are able to give your hand, it is because we have already given ourselves hands. We gave ourselves hands when we stood upright in our paradigm self-technologizing moment, giving ourselves the hands that would no longer simply carry us along the earth, but would instead begin to function independently of the rest of the body, would be able to reach out and hold another hand, granted, but would also be able to reach out to hold something else, something. And if we could imagine giving ourselves hands, if we could hatch such a plan, it was because we were already functioning within the difference of auto-affection, already schooled in giving ourselves to ourselves, even parsoning ourselves out to ourselves, already giving life to ourselves that way from the beginning. So back to the escutcheon to finish. If the final quote, I believe, final slide. So the escutcheon finally says, nope. Do we have the, yeah, there we go. Thank you. So the escutcheon finally says, I'll end the telephone call. I'll turn and give you my back, and you will spoon me, giving me your hand. But in that spooning, the hand you give me, through which I feel myself touch you and myself, will be a hand whose relation to your body has had its properness interrupted or ruptured. It will be a hand you have detached and given me. And it will touch me, whether my hand or my body, and more generally, it will touch me as the hand of another, as a type of mechanical hand. As you put your arm around me, you'll put your hand to work and into circulation, and I'll take it to use it as my own to better feel the peel and press of your envelope. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, David, through that whirlwind tour of phone sex, coat of arms, a few words of Derrida that you came back to again and again, and packed in a number of different ways. It was a tour of different things I did not expect, including a photograph of some spoons. There was something of the fable almost to it. As usual, I'd invite anyone with questions, and we can do two things in terms of questions. Either you can post your question in the chat box, and in which case I can read it out, or we can also invite people to unmute themselves if they wish, and actually also ask the question, as it were, live, as you wish. While people perhaps think of a question, I was drawn by something you said, David, right at the beginning. And it was, you invoked Barthes and the intermittence, and the gape that he talks about. And I was thinking this in light of, so for Barthes, you know, he talks about the striptease, and he's interested in, as you said, the gape. And I was just wondering that in relation to like someone like Nancy, when he talks about the skin, right, and touch, and he's sort of like insisting on this gesture of no mystery, no secret, as he puts it. Like, you know, for example, in his book, as it's translated into English, being nude, right? And so there seems to be maybe like, or at least ostensibly at first appearance, sort of like maybe a tension in those two sort of gestures. I was thinking of like, you know, for example, the gaps of a shield or a knight's armor. Because I was thinking of another shield that Derrida mentions when he talks about the word problema, problem, the Latin, and talks about it being a shield, literally, in the past. And of course, the fact it's in front of you, not a shield. They've got the frontal thing. But the idea of like the chinks between in the armor, right, and spaces, and what that might mean. So like a gesture inspired by Barthes as opposed to by Nancy. And it reminded me there was a tiny passage I was looking at while you were speaking. It's in his book on the syncope, the discourse on the syncope, where he talks about Kant in this language of the knight. Because when you're talking about coats of arms, I was also thinking about, like, you know, the language of chivalry and the language of court and love, right? And the erotic discourse that comes around with coats of arms, right? Not simply the military, though there is that, of course.
Right.
And you know, there's a line from Nancy, again, I'm quoting him in English, where he says, he's talking about Kant, and you remember Kant at the beginning of the critique of the reason, gives this analogy of knights and the Kampfplatz, the battleground, where knights would joust, right? For the hand of metaphysics, right? As he puts it. And so Nancy talks about unless the last, this is me quoting Nancy, unless the last champion canned himself, having won the battle, precisely by renouncing the rules and armor of the tournament, finds himself naked in the presence of the lady, metaphysics, and does not feel the need for a new set of clothing. I was just thinking about that in relation to, like, you know, the intermittent, the gates, and what you want to do with the coat of arms. Because I, for honest, I expected you at a certain point to bring the coat of arms imagery in much more directly. I was just expecting it in relation to this question of the erotic, like, because I was kind of like, but is that something you want to pursue, or is that something you're thinking about pursuing, or is it what you want to be indirect? Or
yeah, it's true that there was a point at which I was going to follow that line. You know, the question of the relation of the coat of arms to a certain eroticism and to courtly love and so on. But it was taking me away from my focus, right? So the short answer would be that in this context, I don't have a plan to develop it further or to expand on the paper as it stands. So that would be the thing. That would be another aspect to think about. I'm not sure straight off the top of my head how I would open that up in any way that would fit into the logic of the talk. But nevertheless, it's there in the background. Yeah. You know, the differences between Barthes gaping and the skin, right, and the sense of it being revelatory in that sense, as opposed to what Nancy says. Yeah, is a difference, not one that I've thought about in terms of contrasting the two. The striking phrase for me in that particular formulation of Barthes, and I can't remember any more, I don't have in my head what the French was, but the idea of appearance as disappearance. So there is the suggestion in Barthes that there is this play of presence and absence that I wanted to relate to Derrida's formulation of that. And of course, in Nancy, although you're right that there is a whole discourse of the skin as a type of visible, right? There is much else in Nancy, such as the things that Derrida brings out on touching, and in the whole logic of the syncope, right? The syncope, that once again would bring us back to a conscious unconscious, an absent present relation. So yeah, you evoked a lot of things that are pertinent to the sorts of things I was saying. I don't have a coherent way of putting them all together.
We have a question in the chat. I haven't read it out yet, so I'll read it, and I'll read it live, as it were. It's from Lynn, as part of Ashley and Oshin's module on politics and philosophy. So that's one of the modules that we're currently teaching at the moment. We looked at excerpts from the first and second volumes of Derrida's Perjury and Pardon. How relevant do you think his philosophy of forgiveness is today, for example, in the context of the war between Ukraine and Russia? Do you agree more with Derrida's argument that the concept of forgiveness disappears if you don't forgive the unforgivable, if you don't forgive the unforgivable? Or do you agree more with Hannah Arendt, who argues that crimes against humanity could not be forgiven? Also, I'm always interested to hear why someone focuses their work on a particular philosopher. What first drew you to Derrida?
Okay, two different questions. What first drew me to Derrida was, in fact, a long time, well, two things. I was drawn to him because he was there, as it were. It's a straight answer that I was studying in France in the late 1970s, and Derrida was visible, although I didn't attend lectures of his. What did I say in the second half of the 1970s? Yeah. I didn't come into direct contact with the person or his work then. I started to read it as part of other work I was involved in. But what really drew me to him and made me think he was somebody I wanted to think about, write about, and concentrate on was, in fact, when I read for the first time the Envois from the postcard, which came out in 1980. And this sentence, it's in particular, in a way, which was not something, there was something striking and touching about it. I did have a sentence in the longer version of this talk where I said when I first read it, I didn't know whether to cry or smile, and I was touched by the idea of a philosopher speaking this way, and that if I did cry, I wouldn't know whether it would be from sympathy or ecstasy or what. So it was that challenge that Derrida's thinking brought to thinking in general, and into my understanding of writing about thinking, that drew me to him. So that's the answer to the second question. You know, in terms of perjury and pardon, it's hard to answer questions about a text whose relation to which is determined mostly by translation, by a type of mechanical approach and a long-term commitment to it that works on that particular register. So in many ways, you know, I've never stepped back and thought so much about, or very much at all, about the ideas there, nor have I written about that text. So what is fascinating, certainly in the text, is the, you know, Derrida's positing of this aporia that one can only forgive the unforgivable. He doesn't say that one can forgive the unforgivable, right? He's saying if there is forgiveness, then it only really has its strong sense in relation to the idea of the unforgivable, and to the challenge that the unforgivable provides to the idea of forgiveness, right? Which is not the same as forgetting, and so on and so forth, which is not the same as justifying, et cetera, et cetera. So I would answer that I agree with Derrida to the extent that I go along with his problematizing of the concept of forgiveness. He pays close attention, as you know, if you've read the text, mostly the first volume, he pays close attention to the whole idea of what gets called in French imprescriptibility, the lack of a statute of limitations on crimes against humanity. So he's certainly raising the possibility of crimes against humanity as being a case of the unforgivable, right? And both in his the extent to which he refers to Yankelevich and Hannah Arendt, he is working with that as a background. But as you know from the second volume, he comes to be interested in these contemporary scenes, dramas of forgiveness, such as the Truth and Reconciliation project in South Africa, or the whole problem of Bill Clinton's impeachment and so on. So, you know, that's not to give a very good answer to your question, or to put it into a particular relation with the current war between Ukraine and Russia, which has its own context and a complicated one, but in relation to which, of course, the idea of crime against humanity has been posed. I mean, that's what I would say first off.
So we have already 2 more questions. They're long ones. I'll give you a little warning about that. I've been reading them to stay up ahead. So this is from Catherine. So she writes, "Thank you for such a captivating talk. The lecture, of course, brings to mind the gap in sex, apropos the gap in language. I'm thinking of Alenka, yes, forgive my pronunciation here, Zupancic's text.
Zupancic, yeah.
What is sex? Where it is argued that the two can never become one in sex. Fell better, just as the gap in language cannot be surmounted. I want to ask about trace. Can Derrida's trace represent perhaps the closest thing to the sublimation of the two that fail to become one? That is, for Hegel, the sublimation of contradiction creates a new identity, but likewise leaves a trace. Just as when a lover leaves, there's only one left and the other's trace. In other words, a one always has some sort of excessive trace, and likewise love or sex can be read as a failure of the two that nonetheless leaves a trace, a memory, a lingering of the other.
Good question, and complex question. So I presume in the first paragraph there's no real question, right? That's a comment about the idea of the two not being able to become one, which I think to some extent my talk was staging as well. In the idea of the trace, they call it the quasi-concept or whatever we call it. You know, Derrida is Hegelian and not Hegelian in much of what he writes. So Hegel would have to be in the back. The idea of a type of sublimation, I guess, would have to be in the background of the idea of difference, but he is precisely displacing that and trying to give a different sense when he talks about trace and difference. He is trying to put the emphasis, if you like, so to displace the emphasis away from a type of teleology of the operation of dialectical sublimation, and suggesting that before we even get to the possibility of such an operation, there has to be something that he would call the trace. So the trace in that sense is nothing left behind, right? It's nothing that was and that we discover after. It is an originary trace, right? It's what gets things going. And difference he would be using synonymously in that idea. And that gets transferred in what I was presenting today onto the idea of auto-affection, that auto-affection is the idea of a trace before either the autos or the affection, right? It's the necessary positing of self as other that has to be functioning in order for the self to be defined and also for the other to be defined. So it is that sort of complication that I don't think Hegel would be able to deal with, strictly speaking, formulate, let's say. And that Derrida, you know, spends a lifetime of his work in fact formulating, even though it was something he came up with from the beginning. Much of his work is going back to that idea, which is difficult to conceive of in many respects, but straightforward in another. If you talk about it in relation to talk about auto-affection in relation to you know, what produces life, what produces the movement that we use to define life, then one can almost conceptualize, if not visualize it in a straightforward way. But I don't know how good an answer that is to your question.
We have another question as well already from earlier on. That's one of my colleagues who just apologizes. He's got children, so I think that's not the reason why he's saying it out loud. So again, I'll read it for him. This is from Dom, and he says, "Thank you for this brilliant weaving of themes. I have a question, and I will preface it with a statement that it is not conditioned by this Zoom call, but by one that took place earlier today. I'm struck by the double absence of dorsality in a Zoom, Teams, whatever call. One, the talking head aspect we have inherited from TV, and two, the 2D frontality of the presentation. I wonder if David had any insights in relation to this. What strikes me is that the frontality can often be violent, and that perhaps turning one's camera mic off is close to turning one's back in a dorsal sense, ? I should also say, I wanted to say this right at the beginning, before the questions, is that I apologize for turning the beginning of this experience into something equivalent to John Cage's 4 minutes and 33 seconds, when I thought we were all playing music and listening to it, but we weren't.
Another good and complicated question. Thanks for it, Dominique. I've never thought about Zoom in relation to dorsality. It's true, but everything you say, I have to agree with. That I don't know to what extent we can presume that a black screen with a name is equivalent to or figurative of dorsality. Certainly it's a type of turning one's back. It's a type of rendering invisible. So there are forms of visuality that seem to be going on in that. I'm thinking off the top of my head here, that are different from the type of surprise that I was trying to think about in terms of dorsality. The representation of a presence by virtue of a black screen with a name seems to me different from the unknown that comes up from behind, if you like, that sort of surprise. So it's a turning away. So so I guess this is what I would think. It's a turning away, then I'm not sure is the same as a turning around, right? But one could argue the opposite. I was very struck by what you said about the violence of frontality, and that can be true too, of course. Any front-to-front relation is a confrontation, right? As much as it is a let's call it a peaceable relation, right? Going all the way to an erotic relation. The idea of confrontation and of violence, as you call it, can never be extracted from that. To what extent the particular format of Zoom stages or encourages that, I'm not sure, but yeah, these are fascinating questions.
There's also a question by Frank, I believe, and he's coming on screen.
Yeah, thank you so much, David. This was really rich and fascinating, captivating. I was wondering, you at one point spoke about the moments where technology constitutes the human, right? Or the human is constituted in an artificial or technological way. And I was wondering what you make against this background, because it's also a particular way of turning one's back of Marx's famous claim that the anatomy of man is the key to the anatomy of the ape. It's not the other way around, right? I mean, because what Marx thinks, it's precisely wrong to think there's first the ape and then we decipher how the human emerges. It's exactly the other way around. But that is not a retrospection. So it's not looking behind one's back, but it's a retroaction, right? So it utterly, there is no key to the anatomy of the ape without the human. So without the, let's say, alienating minimal difference or maximal difference or an unclear form of difference that is established, that allows us to establish a type of continuity, a differential continuity, or a continuity through difference and distance, that is only possible because we change somewhat of the past, so to speak. Does that sit comfortably with your idea, or is it? I mean, no, that's the wrong question. Does that sit within what you're describing, or would you say there is something that is still? Yeah, no, I leave it there.
I mean, what dorsality tries to say in terms of evolution, right? What it tries to do is to impose a contrived moment, right? Which would be the upright stance, right? So this came out of, to some extent, is in conversation with Bernard Stiegler's earlier work, and drawing on, you know, paleontology and so on and so forth. So what one could say about the difference between the ape and the human is probably immediately that that what I'm calling a human could well have been an ape, right? That the idea of imposing in a contrived way this moment when suddenly we become human is a contrivance and nothing more. So whether that means that this is in harmony with what Marx says about you know, the human backing up to the ape, if you like, I don't see why not, in as much as you know, Marx, as we know, was in many ways a thinker of technology, but not always following through in the ways that we would might do today. And but by the same token, you know, the idea of there being a technological ape behind the human, the idea of the human being technologized by the ape behind him or it or her, is not something that I would have a problem with, to put it bluntly. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Could I come in again with a question? And it comes back to those words from Derrida about sleep and the spooning that you gave such an insightful analysis of. This is coming now from a different direction, and that is, you know, Nancy has written a book, again, I'll say into English, is The Fall of Sleep, where he talks about protecting sleep from turning into something else, whether that be sleep understood as, for example, sleep with someone, sex, or whether that be sleep in terms of dreams, psychoanalysis, etc. And just the actual state of sleep itself. And it made me think of this poem. If you wouldn't mind, I would like to read it. It's not one that Nancy mentions, but it just made me, your paper made me think of it. So it's by an Irish poet called Paul Durkin. I put it in the chat, but I'll read it out loud as well. So he writes in this poem, we met in the Valentino in Turin and traveled through Italy by train, sleeping together. I do not mean having sex. I mean sleeping together, of which sexuality is and is not a part. It is the sleeping together that is sacred to me. this yawning together. You can have sex with anyone, but with whom can you sleep? I hate you because having slept with me, you left me. So, because obviously I don't want to de-eroticize the moment, right?
Right.
But there's this question of like the sleep as opposed to the erotic.
Right. Which is very important for the quote, right? That I will turn my back on you to sleep, right? And I guess my question would be, and obviously I didn't go into it in the paper, but my question would be, to what extent is there this distinction that the poem seems to make between a sleep that is somehow the epitome of a relation, right? So the possibility that a relation can survive sleep, right? That's being posed there, which obviously is something quite different from sex. But I guess in terms of the logic I was developing here, I would tend to think that the same sort of question follows one into sleep, right? And that one makes love, one goes to sleep in the other's arms, right? One has achieved that sort of pure erotic and post-erotic moment of love, right? On the other hand, necessarily when one sleeps, one leaves the other, right? So that paradox that the poem is producing at the end, I thought we were so close that we could sleep together, but it turns out that even though we had slept together, you left me, is a little different, but it is, I think, playing with those same ideas of disjunction and junction and disjunction, embrace and forsaking that sleep necessarily involves, right? And the whole idea of the fact that one has to, whether one does it figuratively or not, one has to turn one's back on the other to sleep. So there is that sort of melancholy, if you like, in the escutcheon, in the coat of arms from the beginning, that the poem draws out very nicely. Yeah.
So far, there's no other question. So again, I'm just going to take the opportunity to ask another question. But if anyone does, that's fine, and I'll stop asking questions. But while I have you, I was so to be sort of personal or biographical for a moment. But when I think of spooning up nowadays myself in my own life, I think above all of my children. So I have a 4-year-old. I also have a baby, but I have a 4-year-old, and I was, your title, and it makes sense because the Envois, is talking about lovers. It states that. But your title is eroticism, and it made me think of, well, what is, spooning in relation to some of the other words, what we think of in relation to this question called love. One of them is eros, right? And, if you go to Derrida, like he spends in a number of texts a lot of attention on eros and philia, and agape to a smaller extent, but storge, right, which would normally be sort of like one example of storge would normally be like parents and children, is not one that he really particularly dwells into. So I was thinking about, like, though this is different from the specific line that you've read, because it is explicitly about lovers, what would happen to, I don't know if there's something you thought about, but spooning when it's not think about the erotic, but through something like storge, for example.
Right. Yeah, and I don't have a good answer to the question. It's a very good question, because there is presumably a non-erotic version of spooning. Spooning is not necessarily erotic per se, and the case in point would be the spooning of a child, right, with a child, which I think is mostly related precisely to sleep, right? One spoons a child to put it to sleep, right? It is precisely a relation, a type of proximity that one brings into play in order to give the child sufficient peace to be able to leave the parent, as it were. So does Sorge cover that? Maybe it does, but maybe it still doesn't solve for us the problem of how absence figures and gets performed even in that sort of spooning, right? That the very closeness, whether it be an erotic contact or one of a parental love, that closeness precisely is somehow uttered precisely against the threat of a type of an abyss of absence.
Thanks. I think that's actually very helpful, thinking about it. Especially when moments in one's life one is not really thinking about it philosophically, like spooning my child, and suddenly it comes into a seminar setting. I was wondering also maybe if you could just maybe say a few words on the song, which the audience didn't really hear, but just like again your sort of relationship to it. Obviously, it has the the title of the song is Spooning, but I was wondering your relationship to the song.
Yeah, no, I don't have much of a relationship to the song. I knew it from Cream, which shows my age, their version of it, and it's one of the songs that stayed with me. The expression spooning, I don't think I came across till I came to live in the US. I grew up in New Zealand. So I don't know to what extent contemporary English speakers in that context would use the expression, but we don't have another word for it, right? So so spooning it is. As I have often been, I was fascinated by this particular American figurative usage. Another favorite of mine is rubbernecking. I think that's the most wonderful word. and sometimes I rail against American English when they use impact as a verb, for example, as a transitive verb. But I believe everybody does it these days. Sometimes you have to give up. But other times I'm fascinated and enchanted by the freeness with which American English is able to invent these figures like spooning or rubbernecking. Does everybody know what rubbernecking is these days? When you're driving down one side of a highway and there's something happening on the other, and everybody turns to their head to the side to see what's going on over there, and of course all the traffic slows down on both sides of the road because the rubberneckers are slowing down to rubberneck, and so on. One could maybe do an erotic thing on rubbernecking as well, since necking is is another word for kissing. But in any case, all that to say that no, I was taken by this word, and in relation to this phrase. I mean, the pretext for this article was a book that Lynn Turner is putting together on the erotics of deconstruction. And so when I was asked to contribute to it, this phrase immediately came to mind, stood out for me as an erotic moment in Derrida's work that has struck me from when I was first reading him seriously 40 years ago. So, and then once I thought of spooning, then I thought of the song Spoonful. That came to mind as well. And then I was in Memphis recently, so I heard some blues. So that reinforced it.
On the blues point, this is me harking back to sort of history lessons that I had in secondary school. But wasn't some of the metaphors that were used, and this is a darker question now, unfortunately, in tone, wasn't some of the metaphors that were used to describe the slave industry and the way the slaves are packed into the ships as a type of spooning? Because again, it was about like being as efficient as you could with space. And so since it's a blues song, and you know, it might be understood to be sort of a reappropriation of this idea of spooning, right?
Well, I don't think the song refers to spooning at all. It refers to
spoonful.
Spoonful, right? It's drinking love. Let me drink some of your love. So I think it's on a different track. I have no idea whether the term spooning has been used in terms of the way that slaves were packed in, right, which I saw when in Memphis. I went to the Civil Rights Museum and saw images of that, which were very, very shocking and striking. But I have no idea if the word was used in that relation.
Do we have any other final questions for our guest speaker today? Are we going to turn our back on him and let him at some point get some sleep? Though we're on different time schedules because we're obviously on different places on planet Earth. I think I'm seeing some clapping, some virtual clapping. So I'm going to join in with the virtual clapping. And thank you very much, David, for your timing, and as I said, for this whirlwind tour, which really reminds me of you know, Wittgenstein, when he talks about doing philosophy slowly and in praise of doing philosophy slowly, and just taking those few words of Derrida, which I must have read and just passed over and never really in any way sufficiently gave them any level of detail that you've given, which one could do, of course, with so many other sentences of Derrida, indeed philosophy at large, and really unpack it and show what you can do with just a few words. So thank you.
Well, I was very, very happy to participate. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for the generous introduction, and thanks to the participants for your questions and interest. Thank you.
Thank you everyone for your questions. Thank you, and we'll see you virtually for the people at Dundee next month when we hold our events again. Thanks everyone. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.